Welcome back to VSOW. It's funny. We're constantly bombarded with news about advancements, innovations, things getting better all the time.
Right.
But then you look around and so many people seem to be longing for the past, talking about how things were better back then.
Yeah. It's kind of a paradox, right? I mean, objectively, we've made so much progress in so many areas.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're diving into today, this whole idea of the paradox of progress. We got a stack of really interesting articles and notes you've pulled together, and I- I'm eager to kind of unpack why this disconnect exists.
Yeah, me too. It's like this clash between objective advancement and subjective satisfaction.
Right. Why are so many people, despite all the evidence to the contrary, convinced that the past was somehow better?
Well, the sources you shared actually offer a really good framework for understanding this. We can start by looking at this idea of shifting baselines, how our expectations constantly adjust to new levels of progress.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, as things improve, those improvements become the new normal.
Exactly. And then, our memories, they play a huge role too. This whole idea of selective memory, where we tend to remember the good stuff and kind of filter out the negative
Oh,
experiences.
for sure. We all do that.
And then we've got loss aversion. That's like this inherent human tendency to feel the pain of losing something more strongly than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see how that would tie into this. Like, even if progress brings about positive changes, there's always that fear of losing something familiar.
Absolutely. And then finally, there's the powerful role of nostalgia, particularly nostalgia for our younger selves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We often associate the past with a time when we were younger, maybe more carefree, and those positive feelings get kind of projected onto the entire era.
Exactly.
And it's not just anecdotal, right? You've brought some pretty striking data to the table. These Pew Research Center surveys, for instance, showing a really significant jump in the number of Americans who believe that life was better 50 years ago.
Yeah. Those surveys are really telling. And it's not just limited to the US either. There are international polls pointing to similar sentiments about, financial well-being, a general sense of decline. It's like this global feeling that things were better back in the day.
So we've got these psychological factors at play, shifting baselines, selective memory, loss aversion, and nostalgia. And then we've got actual data suggesting that this belief in a superior past is widespread and, it seems, growing. It's not just some fringe idea.
Right. And what's really interesting is how this sentiment then feeds into the political landscape. Think about slogans like, Make America Great Again. It's tapping directly into this longing for a romanticized past.
Absolutely. We see this kind of nostalgia politics popping up all over the place.
Okay.
Let's unpack all of this, starting with this concept of shifting baselines. The Vox article you shared uses the example of vaccines. Like, think about polio. It was this terrifying disease that really shaped people's lives. And now,
Gone. Practically eradicated.
exactly, but for younger generations who've never had to live with that fear.
It's just not part of their reality.
Right. So how does this kind of success, this progress, becoming the new norm, actually work against our ability to appreciate how good we have it now?
Hmm?
How does it sort of reset our expectations in a way that can even lead to frustration?
Well, I think what happens is that truly impactful progress, when it works, almost becomes invisible. Like, take that polio example. The absence of that disease, which was once this huge threat, just becomes the expected baseline. And so, when we face new challenges or when progress in other areas maybe stalls a bit, our frustration isn't measured against how far we've come, but rather against this new higher standard. We kind of forget what it was like before.
That's so true. It's like we adapt so quickly to the improvements, they just fade into the background. And then, as you pointed out in your notes,
Yeah.
when progress does hit a snag, we can get really frustrated, even by a small decline from this elevated level we've come to expect.
Yeah.
So, like, how does this explain why, say, a slow internet connection today can feel so much more annoying than, I don't know, not having consistent access to clean water would have felt a few generations ago? I mean, objectively, that's a far more serious problem.
Yeah, it's about perspective, right? Our baseline for what's considered acceptable has shifted so dramatically. Think about it. We expect instant communication, access to information at our fingertips, a certain level of comfort and convenience that would have been unimaginable not too long ago. So when that expectation is disrupted, even in a minor way, it feels like a huge deal. It's a deviation from our current norm, which is so far removed from the hardships that previous generations faced on a daily basis. It's not a direct comparison to those past struggles. It's a comparison to our highly elevated expectations.
Okay, let's talk about memory now. The Vox article really emphasizes this tendency we have to kind of airbrush the past, to forget the bad stuff and reinforce the good memories. How does this rosy retrospection, as they call it, shape our perception of the past, especially when you consider some of the objective realities of those times? Like Matthew Iglesias, in one of the pieces you sent, makes this really stark point about running water. He says that having running water in 1950 was about as common as having air conditioning is today. That's pretty mind-blowing, right?
It is, and it really highlights how our selective memories can create this distorted view of the past. We tend to focus on the positive aspects, the sense of community, the simpler times, and, we kind of forget about the lack of access to modern healthcare, the social inequalities that were rampant, the everyday struggles that were just part of life back then. It's like we're constantly creating this highlight reel of the past, and those less pleasant details get edited out.
And it's not just that we're choosing to remember the good stuff. It's also, as your notes point out, that our memories are just, well, not that great to begin with. We forget things. We misremember things. So can you give us a specific example from the sources, a hardship that progress has largely overcome, but that we now kind of take for granted?
Well, one that really jumps out is the dramatic reduction in infant mortality rates. I mean, for most of human history, losing a child was tragically common. Today, in developed countries, it's thankfully much rarer. But because we don't have that same widespread experience of this profound loss, it's easy to overlook the incredible progress that's been made. We don't have that same visceral understanding of what a constant fear it must have been for parents in the past.
That's a really powerful example. Okay, let's move on to loss aversion, this idea that the pain of losing something outweighs the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. How does this built-in bias explain why some people resist progress, even when those changes are objectively beneficial?
Well, think about it this way. Change, even positive change, always involves a certain degree of loss. We might lose familiar routines, established ways of doing things, a sense of control over our environment. And because of loss aversion, we tend to focus on those potential losses more than on the potential gains, even if those gains are ultimately greater.
So it's not necessarily that people are against progress itself, it's that they're wary of what they might have to give up in the process.
Exactly. And this ties in really well with the anxieties that many people feel about rapid technological advancements. There's this fear of job displacement due to automation, concerns about privacy in a digital world, a general sense of being overwhelmed by the pace of change. All of these feed into this sense of loss.
And as you noted in your research, this fear of change, driven by loss aversion, can often lead people to seek comfort in a romanticized past, a time that's perceived as more stable, more secure. How does this play into what your sources call nostalgia politics?
Well, nostalgia politics really thrives on this deep-seated resistance to change, this longing for a simpler time. By invoking a golden age of the past, these movements offer people a sense of security, a retreat from the uncertainties of the present. And it's often less about specific policies and more about tapping into these powerful emotions.
It's like that promise to make things great again is really about evoking a feeling of comfort, familiarity, a return to a time when things felt more in control.
Exactly. And for people who are feeling anxious or threatened by the rapid changes happening around them, that message can be incredibly appealing, even if that idealized version of the past doesn't really align with historical reality.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the more personal side of nostalgia. Your notes highlight this idea that it's not just about yearning for a past era, but often specifically about yearning for our younger selves.
Right.
And I remember that Vox article making this interesting point about how the music and movies that were popular during our youth often become seen as the peak of human creativity in those areas. It's like nothing will ever be as good as the stuff we loved when we were teenagers.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that. I mean, think about it. Those formative years are a time of such intense personal growth and exploration, and the cultural experiences we have during that time become deeply intertwined with our sense of self. So the music we listen to, the movies we watch, they become these potent reminders of a specific time in our lives, a time that often holds a lot of positive emotional weight. And so it's natural to view those things through a nostalgic lens, to see them as somehow better or more authentic. It's not necessarily about objective quality. It's about that strong personal connection.
It's like we're not just nostalgic for the music or the movies themselves. We're nostalgic for who we were when we first experienced them.
Exactly. It's that yearning for our younger selves, for a time when we may be more carefree, more full of potential. And those feelings then get projected onto the entire era.
And here's the thing. While societal progress can do amazing things, longer lifespans, better access to information, all that, it can't actually reverse the aging process for individuals.
Huh.
So how does this inherent limitation of progress contribute to that persistent feeling that the past was somehow better, regardless of all the objective improvements we've made?
That's a really profound point. As individuals, we experience time in a linear way. We age, we change, we face challenges and losses that progress no matter how great can't erase. So that yearning for a past associated with youth, vitality, a sense of unlimited possibility, it's always going to be there on a personal level. And, even if the present offers objectively better living conditions, greater opportunities, that subjective experience of growing older can create this sense that something has been lost along the way.
Let's dive a little deeper into the data now. That Pew Research Center survey you mentioned found that a pretty significant percentage of Americans, almost 60% as of 2023, believed that life was better 50 years ago. Were there any specific demographic groups that stood out in that survey? Like, were certain types of people more likely to hold this belief?
Yeah, the survey did show that older adults and those who identify as conservative were slightly more likely to agree with that statement. But what's really interesting is that the sentiment was surprisingly widespread across different age groups, different political ideologies, which suggests that there are these deeper, maybe even societal forces at play, not just individual nostalgia.
It's like something bigger is going on, something that's fueling this sense of decline.
Right. It could be economic anxieties, the rapid pace of social and cultural change, a perceived loss of community or shared values. These are all things that can contribute to this feeling that things were better in the past.
And you also pointed out that this isn't just an American thing. There are those international polls you mentioned, like the one from Pew, about financial situations across 27 countries. Can you talk a little more about those global perspectives and what they suggest?
Yeah, so that Pew survey, it found that in a majority of the countries surveyed, people felt that the financial situation for the average person was worse than it had been 20 years earlier. And then there are those YouGov polls in the UK showing similar trends. It seems like this perception that things are getting worse is pretty widespread globally.
It's really interesting to see how this sentiment transcends national boundaries. Okay, let's bring this all back to the political realm. That Vox article very clearly links this belief in a superior past to the rise of nostalgia politics, using Make America Great Again as a prime example.
Right.
So how does this kind of slogan, this appeal to a romanticized past, tap in to the psychological factors we've been discussing?
It's incredibly effective because it speaks directly to that desire for simplicity, for security, for a return to a time when things felt less chaotic. It evokes a selective memory of the past, one that often ignores the very real problems and inequalities that existed.
It's like offering a comforting solution to anxieties about the present, even if that solution is based on a somewhat distorted view of history.
Exactly. And it's a very powerful message, especially for people who are feeling disillusioned or left behind by the rapid changes of the modern world.
Your notes also mention that this kind of nostalgia politics often gains traction by promising to restore a past that never really existed.
Right.
So, considering the very real progress that's been made,
Right.
as highlighted in that Vox article, things like increased wealth, greater educational opportunities, advancements in social justice, what are the dangers of basing political movements on a romanticized, maybe even inaccurate view of history?
Well, I think the biggest danger is that it can lead to really misguided policies. If you're trying to solve present-day problems by looking to a past that never actually existed, you're likely to end up with solutions that are ineffective at best and potentially harmful at worst. And it can also be incredibly divisive because it often involves promoting a version of history that was beneficial to some groups while marginalizing or even erasing the experiences of others.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You can't solve the problems of today by trying to recreate a past that never really was.
Exactly. We need to acknowledge and learn from the past, for sure, but we also need to be honest about its complexities and move forward with a clear understanding of the present and a vision for a better future.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. It's clear that this feeling that the good old days were better is like a complex mix of psychology, societal shifts, and maybe even a bit of wishful thinking.
Definitely. And understanding those underlying factors, those psychological tendencies, and how they're being leveraged is really crucial if we want to have honest conversations about the present and build a future that's actually better for everyone.
So for everyone listening, if this deep dive into the paradox of progress has sparked some thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and leave a comment with your own take on this whole idea.
And maybe something to think about as you go about your day. If we're so prone to idealizing the past, how can we ensure that we're not doing the same thing with the present, setting ourselves up for future generations to romanticize a time that maybe wasn't all that great to begin with?
That's a great point. It's all about perspective. Thanks for joining us on VSOW. We'll see you next time.